Hello, Essence of Thought. My name's Josh, and it was a couple days ago I got to make a comment on one of your videos, and it is kind of clear that you don't cherry pick. You're really just making responses to claims, and that's pretty admirable. Because I try and do the same. For the most part, I'm not an expert on science and everything. I was more of an artist when I was growing up, and I'm gonna be honest with you. 10 to 15 minutes is not a whole lot of time to really get a response in, because what's most important to me is not one particular aspect of what I have to say, but it's really the grand scheme of everything, and I really can only do it in the way that I know how to do it. Examples, storytelling, and answering your questions. And I also want to ask you a couple questions too. So if this is too long, I just challenge you to take it, 10 minutes at a time. And if you want to do one video at one point, if you even want to take a couple weeks in between each one, because I know you have a lot of responses, so don't feel that I'm going to be mad or angry if you don't respond to everything I have to say. So I just want to give you kind of that background, just kind of as a warning. I know it was 2 minutes, and I'm sorry. So overall, I just want to say I've watched a lot of your videos, and one of the things that I want to address at first is you do a pretty good job of pointing out when people have, well, mostly with people with multiple videos, or something that you've heard of them in the past, that they lie. So that's good that you address that before anything, because it kind of discredits what they have to say, and that also with scientific evidence, that they're just making a false assumption, and I completely agree with you on that too, because I'm not here to try and scientifically really prove anything. I'm just giving you a perspective. But there's a couple of things I want to address, and I just want to ask, because it wasn't really clear. In one of your videos, you mentioned the probability, I don't know what you think about this, about aliens and about intelligent life on other planets that could have, that could have been around, that could be around, even though we really don't have any sign of that. How can you put that into a perspective of it could be? Because you don't really have just from watching, a could be attitude about an intelligent creator. And this is taking the idea of the God of the Bible out of the picture for just a second. That an intelligent creator to you is not possible, but the idea of aliens could be possible. I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not trying to call you out or anything. I just want you to kind of clarify that for me, what you think about that. And there's a lot of things to really respond to, but one of the things that stuck out to me was the things that are said in the Bible that you had some arguments with people about. Because I know I've done this a lot, with different contexts, different things in the Bible that mean certain things, whether it was taken out of context on the Christian's part or on the person of scrutiny's part. Because I grew up in Oklahoma. I've lived here pretty much my whole life. Was in the military, so I've seen a lot of the world, a lot of opinions, a lot of pretty bad stuff. I've seen a lot of good things. I had the opportunity to go to Egypt on a mission trip when I was younger. It was before I was a Christian. It was kind of when I was in kind of a pretending stage, and I really only became a Christian this last April, and it really put the whole context of faith and circumstances and who God is really into perspective. Because if we talk about from the beginning of time about just what we see in Genesis, let's take that into consideration first. It says that God created the heavens and the earth, and whether people want to get in an argument about the 7-day period, about whether people want to get into an argument about what was created first. I mean, it says it pretty clear, and I usually just take that as what it is. God revealing himself in those specific times, beginning with Adam and Eve, because throughout the Bible we talk about God's love and people's love for God, that the whole idea of a perfect God is the fact that he is in fact perfect, and he can do whatever he wants to do within the confines of his attributes. I'm sure you're asking, what if God has these attributes, then doesn't that limit him on his perfection? Not necessarily. Because our idea of perfect, or our idea of all-powerful, and our idea of all these things, usually when you have these all-powerful beings and all-powerful this or that or this or that, usually we have this, manifestation of somewhat of an asshole, somewhat of someone who has character flaws. Like, for example, I'm not sure if you're a big manga reader, but I mean, in the Naruto manga, you have, at the end right now, you have Sasuke, who's, this idea of this, combined all-powerful person who has these ideas of the world, and the only way to really have good in the world is for him to be the ultimate asshole and to be the enemy for everybody to gather together and root against. And that's not really the kind of thing that I'm talking about right now. Because you have this perfect, all-powerful being. You have God. You have, the Almighty in relation and coupled with his attributes, which actually gets me into a lot of arguments with Christians about certain subjects, about babies, about faith, about the way God works in our lives, and about free will, whether free will actually exists. And I'll address a couple of those as well, because our free will is basically subject to, in reality, to our own choices. Obviously, we have our choices that we make on a daily life. I choose to eat breakfast in the morning, or I choose not to. I choose to go to school because I'm motivated to go to school. I need to finish. There's many choices out there, but there's also that moral ambiguity that comes with those choices, because our morals really shape who we are, and so that aspect of choice is what I believe, just from reading the Bible, is what God was looking for, is that human concept of morality compared to God's concept of morality. And by the way, you're much better at making videos than I am. I'm really terrible at this. This is the third time I've recorded this, and I can't seem to do it in any other way, shape, or fashion. God's love for us is that when he created the world, he wanted to create this perfect creation, but to also give us free will. Knowing that, we would have to have a choice, right? In order to have free will, you have to have choices. Sometimes you say, well, if God was perfect, then a perfect God should make this perfect creation who doesn't make any mistakes. Well, that would be imperfect. That would just be a linear ideal of what we see as perfect. because you can't really correlate it to like a machine, like a perfect machine, like a perfect printer, that never, messes up, which is apparently impossible because printers are the worst things in the world. I hate printers. But for us, we have to have choices in order for God's creation to be perfect, because his intent was love, to love us, to love his creation, and to see that it is good. Now, the reason that it is good is because we have the choice of whether to be good or to not. Now, I'm not saying, in my humanistic point of view of it, that people are inherently humanistically evil, but at the same time, God does put it in his word that we have to choose to follow God or to not follow God. Now, the idea of goodness is implanted into those moral aspects of our life. It's kind of like being at work and being a good employee and then being something else outside of work. Because we can follow through these moral standards from everybody else's point of view. Like, to you, I could, seem pretty moral on, my charity work, the way that I help people, the way my friends see me. But it doesn't necessarily show my inner character, what I'm thinking about all that on the inside. Because if God created us to love us, he has an intent of what we are supposed to be, because he's perfect. Now, with that, you've addressed omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. He knows everything. He is everything, meaning everywhere. He can see all. He is within all. And with that, knows everything that's going to happen. Now, that's where kind of evil comes in. If God loves us, why would he allow sickness? Why would he allow death? And from what I can see, on a scientific point of view, I may be a little bit off, but it makes sense, to me at least, and just, to the people that I talk to, at least in discussion, that when you have perfection at the beginning, because obviously before the choice was made whether to eat from the tree, and I'll talk about that in a minute, before that, everything was perfect. So you have these perfect beings that have no flaws, but when that choice is given to choose God or something that they want, they chose the thing that they wanted. Now, God, loving us, wants to receive love back. That's the whole point of, risk and reward kind of thing. If he says, if you want to be in my presence, you got to love me. And so if we love somebody, whether it be God or whether it be, and when it comes to choices, whether we love sports or whether we love, our spouse or significant other, we choose that person over, or that thing or that activity over all the other activities, as far as being a favorite or being the person in our life that we choose to spend that time with and to make that commitment to. So God wants us to make a commitment to him, because he made that commitment to us of giving us that choice. And part of that is the entrance of evil. And so when you have this perfection that imperfectly chose something else besides God, because of that free will, because of that one tweak, that one thing that can cause something so good to stoop down to a level of something so inherently opposite from what was intended, because intent is the biggest flaw in all this, in us as humans, is that, sorry, I'll take this out so it's taking up too much time, but we see all these things like death, destruction, And in one of your videos, you talked about, how God allows us to go through suffering. And I think a lot of that is, it has to do with that choice. That faith is because I personally believe that everybody has faith in something. Because there's always something that keeps you up in the day, that wakes you up in the morning, that motivates you to to eat breakfast and to go throughout your day and say, hey, today's going to be a good day. Or that thing that says, man, today sucks, but there's this in my life that I know is going to work out, and it keeps going. For you, your humanistic views, which, on a human level is not bad, to help people, all that stuff, that keeps you going. The fact that people are going to help people, but the fact is that everything that we have faith in, everything that keeps us going is temporary. It can fail us at some point in time. There could be a point where, World War III breaks out, and your faith, I guess, in humanity is, I guess that's the only way I know how to put it, your views of humanity and your trust in the system can completely fail, and that will change your entire life. God's idea of faith is that we put our faith in Him and His promises, that no matter what we go through, no matter what struggles come our way, that we have faith that He is going to bring us out of it at some point in time. And we keep that, what people in the church believe is an eternal perspective on things. Because there's always a difference between, what is pleasurable and what is wanted here, rather than the eternal perspective of me doing things to further and to get closer to the end goal. And that's why God revealed Himself in the way that He did. Is from the beginning, when it comes to Adam and Eve, and then eventually to Abraham, Jacob, his brothers, his family, all in the line on down the line with David, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. A lot of these big names of people that in the Bible they said, here is where God is revealing Himself to them. That He revealed Himself to them. That He revealed Himself to them based off their faith. And sometimes we ask ourselves, like, how did they get to that point? Well, in Romans 5, it talks about how, it's either 5 or 1, it talks about how creation itself inherently should be proof that God exists. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what I'm telling you is, hey, this is proof that God exists, but that is what I believe. That is what I see in the Bible, and that is what I make the correlation of how these people came to the revealing of God in their lives, is their idea of God and their seeking of truth and their faith that His existence is in fact real and is in fact a high probability, and in that leap of faith that we take for all kinds of things, whether it be buying a new house or getting married, there's always a leap of faith in some way, shape, or form. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you do it because you're just kind of wanting to see what happens, and which is it kind of correlates to what happened with me in April with my faith. Is you see, and with the Israelites, you have God passing down all these laws. Because with a perfect creator, there is there's stipulations on what perfection is supposed to be, hold on just a second. Sorry, I don't know how to stop and re-record or whatever. So, you have these laws that tell us exactly what that perfection is supposed to look like. And I know you mentioned, the shellfish and all this stuff, and I can go into the nutritional part of it, which is actually a study that I did in my own nutritional life. But there is actually correlations between what was considered unclean and actual health benefits, that people who eat according to what those actual standards were actually live better and eat healthier. Now, you may have an argument for that, and I'd be happy to hear it, because a lot of that also has to do with the people's faith in God, that He would take care of them. Like the manna in the desert, their deliverance from evil, not even deliverance from their masters in Egypt, all the way up until the Promised Land. And we see God's attributes all through that, because at the same time He does demand perfection. But like when the Israelites were worshiping other idols, and Moses took on the miracles on his own doing instead of giving God the credit, He punished everybody in that tribe except for the children. He said, "Hey, you're all guilty. You're all not going to see the Promised Land, but only your children will, because they have not sinned. They have not known what is right from wrong." And so it is good to see, regardless of what kind of skepticism can be said about the laws and what God's intent with that was, He still shows His attributes through His justness, through His love, and that He says, these children are innocent. So maybe that's one example, but and there's also now a lot of times when I do tell that, people ask me, well, what about Elisha when he was when he was confronted from the 42 youths on the hill, when they said, "Oh, go up, Baldy! Oh, go up, Baldy!" And he called the two female bears that mauled all those 42 youths. And at first, to me, that seemed, well, if they're children, that would be against God's attributes. And so I looked into it a little bit further. And, at that time, I'm not sure how exactly pinpoint accurate this is, but it just, from reading ancient Hebrew and from learning from different scholars on what it meant and what their different verbiage was, and the nouns and things like that the word for youths that were used there was the same word for youths in the Solomonian era and in David's era, when they talked about describing Absalom, David's son, who was at that time, when he was pursuing David, between the ages of 18 and 22 is a rough estimate. So I would assume that those youths were between the ages of 18 and 22, which we would consider now adults. And so then we have to answer the question of, why did He curse them? Okay, so He cursed them because, God made it explicitly clear that, prophets were, basically the mouth of God. They proclaimed the mouth of God, and that an insult to a prophet was like an insult to God Himself. Whether that makes sense to you or why I'm saying that in general is just, the consistency of what I see as, in comparison to what I believe. And the innocence of children in general. So to go along and answer some of the things that you've said in some of your other videos, I wanna touch on those to end this. Talk about punishment, about hell, and going along with morality and God's perfection and why He allows sin and everything. The way I like to see it, and the way that it kind of reveals itself in the Bible, is that God does not force His presence upon anybody. As far as eternally, like He does not force you to be with you, because in one of your videos you actually compare God to a stalker, which I don't, and here's why. If I would tell you about a story about a man who was really kind to a girl. Really, sent her flowers, was always helping her out, with things, for years and years, and constantly asking her at some point to go on a date with him. Like, hey, I think we're really good for each other. We always get along. We're like best friends. She's like, well, no, I only see you as a friend. 10 to 15 years go down the line. He's like, you know what? If, I really want to be with you. Please be with me. And she's like, no, I want to be with you as a friend. That's it. I see you as a friend. I don't see you as anything more. Well, eventually, he says, well, if you're not going to love me, then I'm going to force you to love me. Well, what would have been the most loving thing for him to do? Would be to leave her alone, right? I mean, that would be the natural thing, at least, morally say, hey, if you really love her, leave her alone, man. Like, that's kind of the way God sees it with us. He's constantly sending us flowers, constantly, from a Bible perspective, assuming that these are true, assuming that these things are true, then that he did create us and that he did give us, free will and the choices that we have to live our daily lives and to pursue the things that make us happy on a human perspective, will be to leave us alone if we choose not to believe in him. That the idea of hell in literally 95% of the Bible is just a literal separation from God. Now, metaphorically, there's always things that that talk about fire and hell, and whether those are literal or not, I don't know. If I envision hell, I do envision fire. I envision torment and everything, but God does not torture us. It is a separation from God, whatever that means, because that does not fall into his attributes. If we don't choose something, we don't have to be in his presence. Therefore, we are separated. And it's just like the story of the guy who was in hell, and he chose not to follow God. He was very adamant about how he did not want to follow God, and then that he was in so much pain that he said, God, if you would only give me a drop of water to quench my thirst. And God did not respond. God did not help him, because he's just, you didn't choose me. Like, you chose to do what you wanted in your life, and then after death, you decided you didn't want to be with me. So you are not forever. That doesn't mean that the choices that we make here have dire consequences here, as far as being humanistically good, humanistically whatever. So your choices don't really affect me. My views of homosexuality, even, they don't affect me. I'm a little hurt that they changed the view of marriage, and I get that our idea of marriage was somewhat from a flawed system, established in mostly in the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually through the Church of England, and then passed into here. I don't know what points I missed along the way of there, but that's kind of the general tract of where we are. I don't necessarily agree with what a lot of Christians believe about marriage. I am getting married, but we look at the Bible, and we look at what that union was supposed to be between a man and a woman, and so. But it doesn't affect me. It doesn't matter to me whether they legalize gay marriage or not. And it shouldn't to Christians overall. It's because they're not affecting your choices. They're not affecting your relationship with God. So why should I care? So in case that question brings up to your response, I just wanted to give you that. And then you also talked about the more on what a perfect creator should do. I've already touched on a perfect creator would do this, and this, but that's according to you. I mean, you have an idea of perfection. There's a lot of people who have an idea of perfection, but really the whole case is that if you have a perfect God, if you have perfect love, if he has these perfect attributes, and the only way to give us love, the only way to give us choice is to have an alternate choice for that, meaning anything beyond what God gives us. So, you know, if I make a bunch of robots that are, you know, designed to just do everything I wanted to, that were designed to espouse love to me, I love you, Josh, I love you so much, we love you, blah, blah, blah. They don't love me because I made them to love me. They didn't choose anything. They can't choose anything. If God hadn't put the tree in the Garden of Eden, then they wouldn't have had anything to choose. Giving somebody no choice is even more, to me, is even more sadistic, saying, oh, you have a choice, but here's the only thing you can choose. That sounds more sadistic to me than saying, hey, there's this tree with great fruit on it. It'll teach you the wisdom of good and evil, but don't do it because that would be against, you know, me. Whether that's the argument or not is a whole completely different story. But the whole point is that you say you either choose me or you choose this person. And I'm sure you've been with somebody. I don't know what your sexual orientation is, but whatever your, significant other would say, you either choose me or you choose this person. Is it bad if they choose the other person? Not necessarily for them, but it is for you. You don't like it, so you're going to completely just distance yourself from that person. But those people are like, hey, I'm still happy. I'm with the person that I want to be with. So it's all relative. You got to put yourself in the shoes of the, in the eye of the beholder in order to see in the way of the eye of the beholder. And the Bible even teaches us that. Put yourself into the eyes of God in relation to people that you care about and to people in general. Even Paul says is that I am all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. Is that, we try to see, through other people's eyes, and we try to see through God's eyes other people, through their hearts, on what is the most important things. Because, again, choices are choices. There has to be options in order for there to be choices. And love has to do with a choice. Now, you can disagree with that if you want to, but I have to ask you then, what is your definition of love? What is your definition of perfection? What is your definition of truth? Because, even, when you talk about Descartes', definition of reality is that you really can't prove reality other than what you can prove that yourself exists. People take that really out of context. It's to provoke thought, that you can always think beyond what you can see right now. At least that's what I took from it. It could be completely different. But the whole idea of you can only prove to yourself that you exist is the provocation of thought in everything else. Now, to use that as a standard and say, oh, well, I can't prove you exist, so therefore I can't prove anything. Well, that would make everybody false all the time in objectivity. So that's not necessarily what I'm wanting to get into right now. It's basically the personal conviction. Now, going back to going forward, at least. We go into the New Testament and we go into the promise of Christ. With these laws, required sacrifice. If you did disobey one of these laws and you had the ability to make that sacrifice to God, you did so to avoid dying. Because you wanted to appease God's will, assuming that what is in here is true. This is just assuming. I'm not telling you to believe it. I'm just saying, just assuming that it's true. You have to appease what is, required by the law to make that sacrifice. And if you didn't, your sins weren't absolved. And the punishment of death back then was either physical death or eventually, if you died, didn't make your sacrifices, eternal death, eternal separation from God. The same separation that we are at a crossroads with now. And with Jesus' sacrifice, he's like, well, I mean, we've already established this law and how it doesn't work. Nobody can follow it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to live perfectly as the spotless lamb and then be sacrificed in torment. I mean, if you think about what Christ did, you know, you talked about in one of your videos that God sacrificed himself for himself to appease himself. But in a perfect God, why would a perfect God do that? Why would a perfect God sacrifice himself for himself to appease himself? And that's really actually what he did, but to look at it in a context that doesn't just say that and stop, it makes more sense when you say God has a perfect law, that nobody can follow it because people aren't perfect. They chose from the beginning of time that their choices were better than God's choices, that we chose things that we choose every day, that we think, well, these are more important to me than something else. You know, what we choose to do as far as sin, you know, is more important than God. So what he did was he, you know, he came down in the form of man, fully God, fully man, you know, and that's assuming that we have a perfect God, an all-powerful creator, that he can do that. Because the same people that say he can't be fully God and fully man are the same people that say, well, if God's perfect, can he make a boulder big enough that he can't move it? Well, you can't have one without the other. So let's assume, okay, that what is in here is true, and that God came down in the form of man, fully God, fully man, as it is insinuated, that we see his perfect life, his sacrifice for the atonement of sins for all. The only stipulation was that we put our faith in Christ in the acceptance of the Holy Spirit, which convicts us and gives us the insight day to day on our choices, that guides us through our life. Now, that is the part that I can you know, admit to you is unprovable. You know, God in his self is unprovable. He revealed himself to people of faith. It's been that way all throughout the Bible. But it also says in Acts 2, assuming again that everything in the Bible is true as far as the miracles and everything of Jesus Christ, but it does, you know, again, you know, state, and let me read it real quick for you. This is from Acts 2. Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. Basically pointing out, like, y'all were there, y'all saw it. This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him on the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. And then it goes into, you know, David's prophetic view into God's purpose about, you know, I saw the Lord always before me, because he's at my right hand and will not be shaken. Then goes into, because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the paths of life. You fill me with joy in your presence. But basically what we're looking at is, even when God does reveal himself, there are people that will not take hold of it. They called it witchcraft. They called him, you know, a witch of some sort. And they, you know, it's like the Salem witch trials foretold. You know, they burned him at the stake, basically. But what they were really doing was, you know, was fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah and the prophecy of Jeremiah. So, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, say that, you know, these things are necessarily provable. It's just going along in lines of it making sense when you read through, like you do a story. So with that sacrifice, we believe in God. We put our faith in God, and there is somewhat of an element of blind faith in it, where you don't necessarily see God, you don't see him in the flesh, but he reveals himself to you through the Holy Spirit, through saying, okay, so I've seen sin. I've seen what you say about sin, God. I see what people say about you. I see this process, this eternal perspective that people are talking about. And I'm going to take a leap of faith and say, okay, let me have it. I want to put my full faith in you and see what happens. Well, then God reveals himself through the Holy Spirit to that. But, unless the faith is there, because to me, it wasn't for the longest time. It was just kind of I don't really know. I don't really care, but this is kind of the thing that I feel like I have to do, so I'm going to do it. It doesn't really work that way. When you have faith in a system, it's something that keeps you going every single day. If it doesn't keep you going every single day, it's not faith. It's not something that you are selling yourself out for. Like you do with your humanism, or you do with your, faith in humanity. I may be wrong that you may not have faith in humanity at all, but, with, people's faith in their family, with their friends and everything. So it has to fall along those same lines. And when we do that, God works in our lives through prayer, through sufferings, because what happens is when we go through trials, it builds character, and even Paul talks about it in Romans 5. He at that time had kind of a thing going on with himself, but he said, I have seen these things, and we know that we can rejoice God in our sufferings, because suffering brings perseverance. Perseverance brings good character, and good character hope. It goes along with anything. If you go through a bad experience and you come out of it, you're a better person out of it than you were from the beginning, because you've gone through it. Now, sometimes people go through things and it kind of ruins their life for the rest of their life, whether it be through, a sexual assault or the death in the family and everything like that. But that goes right back along with, what do you put your faith in? What keeps you going? What is it, or who is it, or what idea is it that when you have gone through something so horrible, when you have gone through something so bad, that there is that entity, that idea, that will that puts you back into perspective, that keeps you in your daily life without going nuts. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense on the faith part of it. Man, this is a long video. And I'm trying to go through everything that you had talked about before. You also talked about God not wanting nations to come together. I don't think God would have been that way if he had included Gentiles into the promise of Israel, because I firmly believe that that when we talk about the chosen people still, that we're not just talking about the Jews anymore. We're talking about anybody that believes that Israel is God's chosen people, obviously, but that doesn't just include the physical nation of Israel, whether it be back then, now, or 4,000 years from now. That we're talking about anybody who believes. Now, God doesn't say anywhere that he doesn't want nations to come together, because the whole idea of the Tower of Babel, the whole idea of the Tower of Babel was that people were trying to make a tower to get to heaven. They were saying, well, if we pull our resources together, we can get there. Well, no. We know that for certain, that we can't get to a different dimension by building a tower, but the whole idea is that God saw all these people come together in rebellion against him, so he basically was like, all right, if you think that you can do this, well, watch this, and mixed all their languages up. That to me just shows the power of God, if you are assuming that he is an all-powerful creator, then it actually happened. So that's just the way that it is shown. So it's kind of hard to get into this kind of debate and to have this kind of discussion because you don't believe that anything in the Bible is true. I mean, maybe some cultural things and some of the things that Israel went through, but the whole idea of God doesn't compute as far as a possibility for you. So it's kind of hard to address these certain things without the burden of proof. And you're right. When somebody makes an assumption, the burden of proof is on them. But I firmly believe that if God made himself revealed, just as if he did with the choice, if God makes himself revealed to where there's no doubt in anyone's mind that he exists, then that also proposes a problem. Because if we have, without a shadow of a doubt, faith or not, that God exists and everything in the Bible is true, then where does faith come in? It's like if I know God's attributes, if I know God's plan, if I know all these things, and there is no idea of, in my mind, in my human brain, I'm like, well, I mean, I know it's true, so what's the point? I know it's true, so why go through the trouble of having faith in it? Why don't I just live my daily life and just see what happens? It's kind of a weird subject, because that kind of puts a perspective on being set apart. As far as God's promise to us, that we are set apart for his glory, that we have faith regardless of the scrutiny. It's kind of like being recognized and put on a pedestal at a certain company or a certain, I guess we can talk about like the Tom Brady example, when the Patriots put him in, regardless of his 6th round draft pick, and basically as far down as it goes to Mr. Irrelevant. And he went from Mr. Irrelevant to one of the greatest quarterbacks in history, because that coach put a leap of faith in him, regardless of the scrutiny, regardless of the evidence, regardless of what was going on in the past. And yeah, Tom Brady's abilities for everybody to see now, but what happens when we do that same thing with God, and God works in our lives, and he's so evident to us that we can't just put it on paper and say, hey, here's what it is, do it. That same faith can't happen with them, because I can't have that same faith in Tom Brady as his coach did when he put him in and said, this is our guy, we're gonna let's do it, and then he proved himself. I can't have that same faith in him now, because I've already seen it. I've already seen what he can do on the field. I've already seen what he, the records that he's broken. I can't do that. But it does put into perspective of not everything is as clear or as, clean cut as it seems. That it's sometimes there's that gray area where you just kind of run in and be like, I'm going to make a guess. But when it comes to the faith in God, all the evidence that we need to make a hypothesis about whether to have faith in God is in here. Because we have arguments all the time, about the Old Testament and about things that happen, as far as the laws concerning things like rape and things like that. Because you mentioned it in Deuteronomy 22. But one of the things that wasn't talked about was the idea of youth in the woman. That if a woman was too young, it was still considered rape on a different scale. Kind of like how we view aggressive rape and statutory rape. That if I'm having sex with a girl who is underage, even though she's like, yeah, cool, but if we get discovered, I'm going to jail. I'm in trouble. I got to pay the penalty. Not as much of a penalty as if I was aggressively overpowering and raping somebody, but it is still not according to the law that we've set here in this country. And that's what I've always, seen as that correlation. And it makes sense when you actually go back to, you know, the Hebrew and Hebrew cultural concepts when it comes to youth. And even if you don't agree with that, when it came to the actual court process, when somebody in that same chapter was talking about a man who, now it was either 22 or 21 or 20, I can't, I think it was 23 actually, when a man would come to the people and say, hey, you know, I married this girl, but she's not a virgin. Well, if the girl's parents came to them and said, hey, here's proof that she's a virgin, through whatever method, I think it was through, you know, the cloth and the, you know, the breaking of the, you know, the vaginal wall and everything, say, here's the proof, you basically just slandered my daughter. Not just, and it didn't even say slander their family name, you slandered our daughter, you slandered the individual. So your whole idea of women being a bargaining chip doesn't hold as much weight. Now, I do agree that there's a different view of women now than there was back then, but it wasn't as, you know, it wasn't a deal where women were bargaining chips. There's plenty of women in the Bible that were, you know, stalwart faith, you know, ambassadors of God, and God blessed them, and blessed their faith. And even Paul talks about, you know, the blessing of, you know, faith, whether it be a believer of God who marries a man or who marries a woman, and that person is sanctified through the workings of God in their life because they're married to somebody who is working in God. Because the whole idea of marriage and the whole idea of that union is that the two people become one, and so that person is being worked on and is actually witnessing the work of God in their life, and, you know, helps them out with that process. Now, going back to Deuteronomy, the whole idea was that they were slandering the girl, not just slandering the people's family. That God's law was protecting that girl from being put in a situation that she didn't want to be in. Now, obviously, there's other parts of the Bible, and if you have, you know, questions, I mean, I can make another response video. It wouldn't be this long, because this one is long because I'm trying to address everything that you've said in your other videos that I've watched, and to kind of put it all together. The reason why it's important to see the God of the Bible in correlation to what we can see on the outside is that yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debates about, you know, the origin of the universe and things like that, but as an ex-Christian, you did at one point make it make sense to you, and maybe it didn't afterwards, but there is an argument to be made, and I guess a puzzle to be put together in a certain way that it all makes sense. Now, there are parts of the Bible that don't make a whole lot of sense to me, like Revelation. I'm not real good with metaphors, so I try to see it literally, and it just sounds like a bad dream to me, so I don't read it a whole lot. You know, I'm, you know, actually waiting to go to a class on that so I can kind of learn about all those metaphors and everything, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense. But the parts that make sense is, you know, God's perfection demanding perfection, and then when that perfection wasn't met, instead of just throwing it in the air and saying, well, screw it, he set himself up for a sacrifice and living a perfect life on here on earth, and lowering himself in his perfection to here, you know, healing the sick, healing the lame, healing the blind, and giving those parables of, you know, living water and the sowing of the seeds and the reaping of the harvest and the innocence of children and the innocence of life in general, puts into perspective that our choices literally govern how our lives are to play out. Because you may not see the correlation between God's moral law and our human moral standards, but it plays out all the time. Now, you can you can make any argument that you want to about, you know, the similarities between homosexual marriage and our marriage as, you know, man and woman in general. But even that is kind of a long stretch, because again, sorry for the time, but there's just a lot of things to talk about. So we'll talk about that too. When you look at a moral standard, when you talk about a moral obligation to things, the responsibility, it's the best way to put this. When I have sex, I'm basically saving myself for someone who I am taking on the responsibility of parenthood, because part of our anatomy is that pleasurable act, that sex, is going to lead to childbirth at some point or another. What, you know, I know it doesn't do it every time, but, you know, once the sperm meets the egg, boom, it's going to happen. And so that puts us into a perspective of, well, I guess we shouldn't really do this with anybody, because I don't want to have a kid with somebody who I don't want to have to deal with for the rest of my life. And my computer went blank. I don't want to have to deal with for the rest of my life. So I'm going to wait till somebody comes along and I want to have, you know, kids with them, and I don't mind spending the rest of my life with them, that I love them, that I want to become one family unit with and share that with them. And that's what makes marriage and sex so sacred, is that it's not just a pleasurable act that you wait for somebody to share it with, that you love and want to spend the rest of your life with, but that is coupled with the idea of, hey, reproduction. And, you know, yeah, I mean, there's complications along the way. There's some people that can't have kids. There's some people that cannot reproduce. But that comes all into also the point of allowing suffering and the evil that other people do that turns into good. Like when kids are unwanted and they get put into adoption homes, there are now people, you know, that want to have kids that can now have a child by adopting them into their family, which puts into better perspective of what God did for us. You know, when he talks about in Romans 8, that says, therefore, brothers, we have an obligation in view of God's mercy to offer, or that's the wrong one. Man, it's been a long day. Therefore, brothers, we have an obligation, but it is not according to the sinful nature to live according to it. For if you live according to the sinful nature, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live, because those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For if you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received a spirit of sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. Abba in Hebrew is like what kids would call their dad, like daddy. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are God's children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. Indeed, if we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. Which puts in perspective of, one, sonship in correlation with our humanly idea of adoption, and then also in the sufferings. Because Jesus Christ suffered and died for us, that sometimes we do go through sufferings in our lives and learn to take those as a rejoicing opportunity to say, hey, my faith is above all this stuff that's going on in my life. The sickness, the death, the destruction, the wars, it all is meaningless. Even Paul, meaningless, when he talks about the wants and needs, and and wars and conflicts, they're all just meaningless in terms of our eternal perspective. And that's what helps me in my daily life, is that everything that happens to me that's bad is not really worth worrying about. Yeah, sometimes I get upset and I cry and I get I get all, worked up over stuff, but when it comes to the perspective of eternity, and it comes to the perspective of in the future, whether it be a couple of days, whether it be a couple of years, or whether it be after I die, there's reward, and there's rejoicing, because after it is all said and done, and once I place my faith in that situation and put all my burdens on God, then, he says, well, you did it right, so here's some reward. And the whole idea is that it's not just in eternity, it's here on earth as well. There are earthly rewards for that kind of thing. Having a good life, having a good job. Sometimes those are rewards that God give us. Now, if we don't have a good job, if we don't have a good life, there are other things to rejoice in. The lives that we touch in our story, that help other people to get to where they are as well. Because I didn't have a great high school experience with friends and everything, and I didn't have the best attitude as a kid, and a lot of that correlated together with, hey, I'm just going through a bunch of crap, and going through the military and going through a lot of family struggles. God puts it into perspective in my life and say, hey, just put your faith in me and I will take care of you. And that way I see the blessings more than I see, the things that are going on in my life. So that kind of filters those out, and the good things are put in. I give God the glory, and they multiply. They're able to affect other people's lives in a way that's like, hey, you just put your faith in him, and good things will happen. Maybe not for you right now, or really, anytime soon, but he can touch the lives around you. He can help you in, situations of health, work, your daily life, or put into a perspective of the temporary nature of our sufferings as people. And a lot of times that just doesn't make sense to people, because they want a healthy life regardless, every day, no matter what. Now, also part of that goes into the imperfection that we had from the beginning, which unfortunately is just part of it, because we have those choices to make. We have those obligations, whether it be to God or whether it be to our family or to ourselves, that we have to make the best choices for our lives in order to see fruitful bearing of our character revealed to other people. And also, at the same time, when other people see it, we internally humble ourselves and say, I give the glory to God, and he is the one that did it. He is the one that gave me the strength, that gave me the motivation, the perspective, because perspective is probably the most important part of this whole thing, is that it's not just, I'm going to get something out of it, so I did it, but it's the perspective of how temporary our sufferings are. I just beat a dead horse for about 10 minutes on that, but it's important. And you did talk about, I guess I already kind of addressed it. I guess I should have, mentioned the actual quote, and it goes back beyond the whole thing of God basically setting us up for failure. Now, that itself is not true. God didn't necessarily set us up for failure. He gave us the choice, and we chose wrong. Now, I say we because, human nature back then, humans' choices back then, but we have our own choices now. That's what's the most important part, is that you still, while you're alive, you still have choices. You still have things that you can do to better your own life. There are things that you sacrifice in order to better some parts of your life. And all God really asks for is our sacrifice of our selfish need to rely on ourselves for our happiness and for our joy. Because things can make you temporarily happy about things, but they don't necessarily mean anything in retrospect to and taking eternity out of it, for the rest of our lives. Because with that moral standard, there has to be, a reason for all those moral standards. And when you talk about, abortion and things like that, it's literally literally, in the legalizing of things like that, taking the moral responsibility out of people's lives and putting convenience in. Now, obviously, it's different with rape and with, things like that, but at the same time, you take these concepts that I just beat a dead horse on about suffering, is that, if I had a daughter and she was 14 years old and was raped and she was pregnant and she was like, Dad, I want to get rid of this, I would say, I would encourage you. Obviously, I would, I don't want to let her go through that, but I would give her the choice, but I would encourage her to have the child and say, if you have this child, I will look after his life, give him to a good family, and keep track of him. Even though this bad thing happened, you will see years and years down the line how great this kid's life is. And even if he doesn't necessarily have as good a life as you do, that he's succeeding, that he's making life choices, that he is going through his own trials of life, that he is overcoming life just like you are, going through things like I went through, and that, you can see, wow, I was ready to just get rid of this burden, but now I can see this person, this being, whether he or she, that is living their life, laughing, playing, enjoying, succeeding, loving, and then, making mistakes along the way, but impacting other people's lives in that sense. And that creates a story of success from suffering. Because in that same sense, there's always good that can come of everything. If we just keep thinking that there's bad, just get rid of it all, what are we really doing? We're just kind of getting rid of obstacles. It's kind of like the whole idea of, people who have their own circle of trust. If you are so distrusting in people that you keep throwing people out of your circle, eventually you're going to be the only person in that circle left. And frankly, that's not really the way to live. And it's the same with our morals. If we keep throwing out certain moral obligations, as far as, life is life. If we take that out of our psyche, out of our daily lives, eventually life is not going to really mean much to us at all. So, I'd hate to bring up the whole slippery slope thing, but that's just kind of where it leads. And part of that morality comes from a perspective of putting things in a higher order than your own personal needs and wants. Because obviously, I'm not going to be a jerk and force my daughter into going through 9 months of pregnancy and have a child that she doesn't want because of that wrong thing that was done to her. But putting things into a different perspective can make such a big difference, can make such a huge impact on somebody's life. And part of that is the whole concept that, it goes right back to the concept of marriage, of what God gives us in our lives to bring that moral standard. I hope I answered all your questions, and I hope that you can respond and give me a shout.